Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for being there. As Simon said, this talk tonight is about the 21st Division at the Battle of Loos. The units of 21st Division disembarked on French soil between the 9th and the 12th of September 1915. 2 weeks later, with absolutely no prior battlefield experience and very little in the way of acclimatisation to the realities of the Western Front, they were thrown into action at the Battle of Loos on the second day of that battle. It's perhaps interesting to note that had the battle begun on the date originally planned, that is the 8th of September, the division would still have been in England at the time. Now, the aim of this talk tonight is to examine how the units of 21st Division actually performed on that day. It's been a topic of controversy for over 100 years now. The popular perception is that they, and I quote, disgraced themselves and the new army by retiring before the enemy. That's from the Official History 1915, Volume 2. Thankfully, though, Edmonds does go on to warn the reader of the, and I quote, legends that have grown up regarding their actions. The widely accepted narrative is that the 21st and 24th Divisions advanced against the German second line of defence on the second day of the battle and were routed by enemy machine gun fire. I would say this is far too simplistic. The true picture is far more complicated than that and far less damning of the division's performance. I've got no intention at all of going into a detailed narrative of either the planning or the execution of the first day of the battle. I'm sure many of you out there know it far better than I do. But a little bit of background information is necessary, I suppose, to put the second day into some sort of context. The 21st Division, along with the 24th and the newly constituted Guards Division, have been formed into 11th Corps, that is under the command of Lieutenant General Haking. 11th Corps would be the reserve force and would be used to exploit any initial successes made on that first day. The controversy, unfortunately, begins long before the battle. You might recognise those two. Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief, BEF, wanted to use the reserves only when initial success had been achieved, and thus intended to keep them under his control and command, releasing them to Sir Douglas Haig, commander of First Army at the time, only when, and this is according to Sir William Robertson, the Germans were absolutely smashed and retiring in disorder. Haig's plan, on the other hand, called for the reserves to be used to ensure the hoped-for initial success. That's how Nick Lloyd put it in his recent book on the battle. It all boiled down to 2 points of disagreement between the two commanders, I suppose. Firstly, how far back from the battlefield the reserves would be held, and secondly, how soon they would be placed under Haig's command. And as we shall see later, the answer to these two questions are A, too far, and B, too late. We do need to go back a little way before Haig's acute attack of optimism just prior to the battle, however. The Battle of Loos was, of course, part of a grand French plan to win the war in 1915, and the choice of the ground over which the BEF would attack was also down to General Joffre. Sir John French sent Haig to recce the ground and then submit what I suppose today will be called a feasibility study. Haig sent his report to GHQ on the 23rd of June 1915, and the 5.5 pages of it do not make reassuring reading. He even submitted a supplementary report 2 days later and neatly summed up his thoughts in one phrase. He simply said, "This area is not favourable for an attack." He did see some scope for maybe a small-scale attack around the village of Loos itself, and he proposed that it might just be possible to take the Hohenzollern redoubt at the same time, but that was about it. So, with that in mind, Sir John French accordingly tried to scale down the BEF's involvement in the grand scheme, but he was told in no uncertain terms by Lord Kitchener that a full-scale assault must go ahead. And so it did. Now, on your screen at the moment, you should have an overview of the whole battlefield as it was on the morning of 25th of September. Towards the north of the map there, you see the La Bassée Canal moving down the Hohenzollern redoubt. The red line is the British front line on that morning, and the two thick black lines are respectively the German first and second lines. Loos village is towards the southern end of the map. At the end of the first day, the situation was roughly like that. The red dotted lines now show you the ground gain by the British attacks that day. A day of mixed fortune that first day, and of high casualties. Nick Lloyd in his book estimates that could be as high as 19,000 casualties, with over 6,300 of them being fatal. 9 battalion commanders have been killed and a further 12 wounded. So I suppose it's no wonder that none of the depleted battalions were asked to attack the German second line on day 2 of the battle. That unenviable task belonged to 11th Corps. The advance of the 21st Division, and 24th for that matter, just so we know where we are, would take them into that area marked by the red circle. Okay, let's take a step back at the moment and look at the units that made up 21st Division. We've got 62nd, 63rd and 64th Brigade. Now it's largely, as you can see, made up of battalions from the north of England, Northumberland, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Durham mainly, but as you can see in 63rd Brigade, somehow the 8th Somerset Light Infantry managed to creep in. I don't know how they managed to do that, but there they are. In command was Major General George Forestier Walker. He'd taken over command, as you can see there, on the 11th of April 1915. His performance at Loos could probably best be illustrated by the fact that he was removed from command on the 18th of November 1915. And his letters to the official historian 10 or so years later are, not surprisingly, largely aimed at retrieving his own reputation. Although, to be fair to him, in some of his later correspondence, this correspondence lasted something over 10 years. By the end, he was saying that his memory was a little bit fuzzy, and perhaps he'd made rather too many positive claims in some of his earlier correspondence. Anyway, let's look over the ground over which 21st Division's attack took place. I'm sure quite a few of you have stood where I stood to take that photograph on the platform in the corner of Dud Corner Cemetery. I show that simply so you can see the countryside outside. That's the view over towards Loos village, which is nestled in the valley towards the right-hand side of the photograph. And if you walk to the far end of the cemetery and look out of the fields, that's what you get. And as the caption says, not the best ground for an attack, not much in the way of cover. The contemporary view would give you that. That, of course, is no longer there. That's Tower Bridge, the winding mechanism at the southeastern end of the village of Loos, and the double crassier, the slag heap, basically, which stretched out again towards the southeast. That's all gone now, of course. Well, in the end, the reserves, 21st and 24th Division, were held approximately 5,000 to 7,000 yards from the 25th of September front line. There's maybe a little bit of controversy about exactly when they were released into Haig's command. It's not important that we argue the point now, but suffice it to say that orders to that effect didn't reach 21st Division until around 10:45 a.m. on that morning. And the 1st Brigades moved off around half an hour later. Now they marched, or tried to, along roads congested with vehicles moving in both directions, parties of wounded making their way back to the rear areas. And unfortunately, 3rd Cavalry Division were also moving around there. They were moving across the line of march of the reserve brigades. The traffic congestion was appalling. In the official history, Edmonds describes it. I don't quote exactly, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it was like trying to push the Lord Mayor's parade through the streets of London without having closed the streets in the first place. The initial orders given to the reserves were to take up positions at a village called Mazingarbe, which is still about 5,000 to 6,000 yards to the west of Loos village. And the final units weren't in place there until about 1600 hours on the 25th. And at that point, they were still totally ignorant of the situation in front of them. So was 11th Corps HQ. An order issued at 3:30 that afternoon, based on nothing more than optimistic rumours, required the 21st Division to capture the high ground around the village of Annay and then secure the canal crossings at Arnes. I put that map up just to show you that, well, those two places aren't on the map. Annay and Arnes are respectively 4 and 5 miles east of Loos, still behind the as yet unbroken German second line, which you can just see on the right-hand side of that map. Thankfully, subsequent orders would be slightly less ambitious. Now, the first units to advance to the battlefield were the 4 battalions of 62nd Brigade under Brigadier General E.B. Wilkinson. Even before they got into action, they were temporarily, supposedly temporarily, detached from 21st Division and placed under the command of 15th Division. Now, 15th Division troops were in positions indicated by the red dotted line on the map there, facing Hill 70. Wilkinson, with no idea of the troop position or of the ground ahead, simply pointed out Hill 70 to his battalion commanders on a map and told them, I quote, "We do not know what has happened on Hill 70. You must go and find out." So initially, at about 1500 hours, he sent just 2 battalions forward, the East Yorks and the 10th Yorks, and they moved off down the Bethune to Loos Road, indicated by the arrow there. The 12th and 13th Northumberland Fusiliers would follow later. Now, as the leading battalion reached the old German front line, they came under heavy shell fire, mainly shrapnel. The transport section at the rear of the column was practically wiped out. Now, they should, at this point, have left the road and advanced that way through Loos village. But in the confusion, not helped by the lack of maps, none of the battalion commanders had maps. The 8th East Yorks and some of the 10th Yorksmen continued to the south, down there, and bumped into units of the 1st 20th Londons at Chalk Pit Copse, which is just off the bottom end of this map. Now, despite efforts by members of the 1st 20th Londons to stop them, they advanced beyond the copse and came under heavy machine gun fire. Confusion reigned. The men didn't know exactly where they were, and an order sent by a Weatherhead, Brigade Major 62nd Brigade at 1740 to the 10th Yorks, sums it up really. I quote that order: "Push on as quick as you can to Hill 70. Have you seen anything of the East Yorks Regiment? So clearly they didn't really know what was going on in front of them. Luckily, Lieutenant Colonels Way and Haddo of the 8th East Yorks and 10th Yorks respectively restored some semblance of order and had their men dig in at the positions shown here. There are the 8th East Yorks, just by the double crassier, the large slag heap, and the 10th Yorks were a little further back on the left, just on the outskirts of the village. Okay, they're in position now. What about the 12th and 13th Northumberland Fusiliers? Well, they too marched towards Loos village and came under fire about 7:15 that night. The 12th pressed on through the village and eventually held station around there. Ready, and it says in the 12th Northumberland Fusiliers War Diary, ready to charge with the bayonet in case of enemy appearance. The 13th, by now 62nd Brigade HQ, had completely lost touch with them apparently. They also pushed on through Loos village and were eventually ordered to hold their position in the open ground just to the east of the Loos-Hullock Road. So they're positioned about there. B Company of that battalion was requested to be sent forward to support the remnants of the Scottish regiments on the slopes of Hill 70. So there goes B Company. Now, Brigadier General Nichols, commanding officer of 63rd Brigade, has orders to advance to the Loos-Hullock Road by night, and then, here we go again, advance against the German trenches in the direction of Annay, that town, that village, which is way off the right-hand side of the map. Now, they too marched down the main road towards Loos, but then veered to the north. The 8th Lincolns and the 8th Somerset Light Infantry heading for what was called Point 69. The other two battalions, the 10th Yorks and Lancs and the 12th West Yorks, took a slightly different route that way to arrive at the same point. 3 of the battalions were in place by about 11 o'clock that night. The 10th Yorks and Lancs, unfortunately, were a bit late, but they arrived just in time to join the onward march at midnight. midnight. As you can see, any thoughts of using the reserves on the first day of the battle had long since passed. Now, the 12th West Yorks and 8th Links led the way across the open grassland, there we go, on a compass bearing, 112 degrees. Now, given the lack of communication already in evidence, it's no surprise that 63rd Brigade's arrival at Chalk Pit Wood was unexpected by the men of 1st Division who were already there. They came under machine gun fire as they approached and fixed bayonets ready to attack before realizing that the gunfire had come from Hill 70 and that the wood was held by units of 44th and 2nd Brigades. Now, the latter had almost fired on their comrades, being ignorant, as I say, of their imminent arrival. The order to relieve these units had failed to reach Brigadier Nichols, but after consultation with the incumbent Brigadier Pollard of 2nd Brigade, decided that, seeing as they were there, a relief would probably be a good idea. So, indeed, they went ahead. Excuse me. Positions in places no more than improvised rifle pits were taken up as follows. 10th Yorks and Lancs were there along the Hullock to Lens Road. Hullock is a village just to the north of the map, and its importance will become relevant a little later. The 12th West Yorks to the south, but beyond that road. The 8th Links, they straddled Bois Hugo, the wood there, but for some reason that nobody has been able to fathom since, is that they didn't place any troops actually in the wood, just to the north and to the south of it. 2 companies of the 8th Somerset Light Infantry were slightly further back, but unfortunately A and D companies strayed some distance to the south, lost touch completely with their compatriots, and weren't seen again until they took part in the attack on Hill 70 the following morning. Not that they'd been ordered to, but they joined in an attack that was going in past them. So now we have two of the brigades in place. 64th Brigade brought up the other rear, having a torrid time in the confused back areas, and only arrived in their supporting positions as daylight was almost upon them. They got no idea what was happening ahead of them, so they decided to await events, and they were positioned as so. The 15th and 14th Durham Light Infantry on the road there, the 9th and the 10th Coilies behind them, just to the north of the village. We now have all three brigades in position and ready for action on the morning of the 26th. Plans for the assault on that German second line had thankfully evolved. There's a slightly different map, but it shows the plan. Loos village is there towards the bottom left. To eliminate flanking fire, which was going to be a problem, Hullock, as I said, just to the north of the map, and Hill 70 would be attacked at 9 o'clock on the 26th of September, following a 1 hour preparatory artillery barrage. The 24th and 21st Divisions would constitute the main attack, going in along those red arrows at 11 o'clock that morning. Problem number one. The German second line had actually been out of range of the British artillery on the first day of the battle, and the barrage planned for the 26th unfortunately turned out to be very weak, as units struggled to bring their guns forward. In fact, dawn on the 26th of September, none of the British guns had actually been able to be brought forward past the original front lines. And when they did get into position, they were on a forward-facing slope and came under fire from German artillery too. And also, there would be no smoke and no gas available, as had been on the first day. Problem number two. During the night, the Germans had brought 22 additional battalions into the line. The second line, therefore, was more strongly held than the first line had been on the previous day. Problem number three. 21st Division was critically weakened already. As we've seen, 62nd Brigade was attached to 15th Division and was earmarked to support 45th Brigade in the Hill 70 attack at 9 o'clock. 63rd Brigade in the woods were unfortunately by now struggling to hold back a counter-attack from newly arrived German units. More of that later. 64th Brigade's orders reflected a lack of clarity, another one, at HQ. They were supposedly going to get in touch with 63rd Brigade. Failing that, they were to take part in the 11 o'clock attack. If 63rd Brigade did in the end attack, they were to maintain their position in reserve. The order's final sentence sums up the confusion. Make any move you think desirable. And I quote from the 64th Brigade War Diary. The best case scenario then for this supposed divisional attack was therefore by a brigade strength assault, possibly with the 2nd Brigade in support. In reality, with the other two brigades somewhat busy, as we shall see, it came down to the discretion of 64th Brigade as to whether it took place at all. That's a view, an aerial view taken at the time of the battlefield. Lance Road Redoubt is marked there on the main road down to Loos. That, of course, is the situation, the place now where you will find Dud Corner Cemetery. Loos Village is marked and Hill 70 is arrowed there. you can now see the German second line and the positions of the 3 battalions. The attack should be going in straight ahead of where the 64th Brigade are. So, what happened? Well, orders for the attack on Hill 70 arrived late, and unfortunately, men were caught under the British barrage as it began at 8 o'clock. Again, quite feeble, I'm afraid, as it turned out, 2 shells per minute per battery, but enough to cause some casualties to the Northumberland Fusilier battalions who hadn't moved out of the way because the order just simply hadn't reached them. And just as the attack went in, indicated by the red arrows on the map, the early morning mist cleared from the valley, giving the German machine gunners on Hill 70 a clear view of the assaulting battalions. Now, the attack managed to capture the perimeter trenches of Hill 70 redoubt after some severe hand-to-hand fighting, but the centre of the redoubt remained in German hands, despite of attempts to push forward on either side of it. 120 of the 8th East Yorks took part in that advance, led by Lieutenant Colonel Way. Now, they were caught in frontal fire from the redoubt and in the left flank from positions on the Hulk to Lens Road. According to Major Ingalls, writing in 1926, the line just withered away, and the commanding officer, Colonel Way, was severely wounded also in that attack. The 10th Yorks and the 12th Northumberland Fusiliers advanced about 200 yards behind the leading 45th Brigade assault. Now, they were met by some of the Scots retiring from the crest, but they pushed on and in fact carried some of the Scots back with them, back over the crest on either side of the redoubt. Now, here also the attack began to falter. On the left, the 12th Northumberland Fusiliers were eventually forced to retire. And on the right, the 10th Yorks were pinned down just short of the German front line. Gallant but unsuccessful attempts were made to get the men forward. Lieutenant Colonel Haddo, commanding 10th Yorks, stood up, shouted, "Charge," rushed forward, only to be cut down immediately and killed. Now, on seeing this, his second in command, Major Dent, also stood up to initiate a charge, but met the same fate as his CO. And I always find it difficult to understand what followed, because 3 more officers, Major Noyes and Captains Charteris and Lynch, all made similar unsuccessful and ultimately fatal attempts to lead the battalion forward. It was Lieutenant Colonel Haddo's first action. He's buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery in Loos, and as it says there on the caption, please note the incorrect date on the gravestone. If you allow me a slight digression here, I found this wonderful photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Haddo along with his brothers. 8 brothers, including the one in the insert there, all went to Harrow and are in fact nicknamed the Haddos of Harrow. And you've got to admire the moustaches. They're all the same. They're brilliant. If you go left to right on that photograph, you've got Arthur de Salis Haddo, 10th Yorks commander. You then have Cecil MacDonald Haddo, who'd been a lieutenant in the Second Afghan War and was wounded in the leg, a colonel by February 1902 and retired 2 months after that. Reginald Campbell Haddo, colonel in the 15th Sikhs, awarded DSO. And then, quite interesting, standing at the back, Patrick Francis Haddo, Wimbledon single men's champion, 1878, who then went on to become chairman of the P&O Shipping Company, also played cricket for Middlesex. The next 2 also played cricket for Middlesex and Harrow. And towards the right-hand side of the photograph, we have Alexander, again, a Middlesex cricketer, And in the inset, we have Douglas Robert Haddo. Unfortunately, I believe him to have been already dead by the time this photograph was taken. He died on the descent following the first ever ascent of the Matterhorn. He slipped and dragged three of the members of the party with him to their deaths. Enough of the digression. There's probably another talk and a book in that one photograph, to be honest. Moving on. Lieutenant Colonel Haddo had written a brief letter to his wife on the morning of the Hill 70 attack. I wonder if I shall ever finish this, or whether this morning is my last on earth. We are just off. Goodbye, with love, Arthur. Now, Haddo's son, you see pictured there, Second Lieutenant Gerald Francis Haddo, 2nd Battalion Yorkshire Regiment, had been killed in action on the 15th of June that year. A sad year for that family. Moving on. A full retreat from Hill 70 ensued for the men of 62nd Brigade, not surprisingly. And casualties can be calculated as follows. I'm not going to go into any detail on those. Suffice it to say, if you glance down the officers column, it's quite striking how high those numbers are for officer casualties in each battalion. Over 1,000, almost 1,500, shall we say, in total on that abortive attack on Hill 70. Okay, let's return to 63rd Brigade now, defending the woods north of Loos. Now, Brigadier General Nichols had established his headquarters in the chalk pit adjacent to the Hullock Launch Road. And at around 7 o'clock on the 26th in the morning, he was briefing his battalion commanders on an attack on the German second line that he was going to send in at 0800. Now, clearly, he hadn't got the order for the 11 o'clock attack yet. Luckily, it arrived just in time, informing him of the proposed 11 o'clock assault, and he was able to cancel his 8 o'clock order and wait. To illustrate the vagueness of these orders, in fact, though, when they did get there, it's all I have to do is to tell you about Major Storer of the 8th Links, who was telling his fellow officers that, and I quote, "We were to attack the enemy trenches over there." That was it. No indication of the distance to or the strength of the German defences. Unfortunately, by dawn, those orders were fast becoming irrelevant. The 63rd Brigade positions were under attack from the east, you see the grey arrow there, and from the south, there's the other one, by the 153rd Infantry Regiment, the Altenburger Regiment. And there's a rather splendid photograph of some of the members of that regiment taken in Metz. The caption, the little shield on the left, basically says, in memory of the battles against France, 1914-15. So whether it was taken just before Loos or just after, unfortunately, we've no way of knowing. And rather sentimentally on the shield on the right, in the German there, it does actually say, "Who knows whether we will see each other again." Now, the Germans were of the opinion that the loss of Hill 70, not that it's much of a hill if you go and look at it, but they still thought that the loss of that hill would be, and I quote from the regimental history, disastrous. At about 7 p.m. on the 25th of September, the eventual goal being the retaking of the village of Loos itself. Now, that map is taken from the Altenburger regimental history. The 1st and 2nd battalions, you can see the 1st battalion positions to the north of the map, and there the 2nd battalion. They were in position by about 20 to 10 and ordered to attack at 2300. Thankfully, I suppose, the German awareness of the situation was almost as vague as that of the British, and their maps weren't much better. At about 1 o'clock in the morning of the 26th, advancing in the dark into the unknown, as the regimental historian put it, they mistook a track for the Hullock to Lens Road and halted there. Their presence was noted by the British, and the 63rd Brigade men were able to fire at them from directly ahead and from the flank, successfully pinning them down. Some German troops did, however, manage to infiltrate the non-occupied stretch of Bois Hugo, which they call the Steinwald, as you can see on the map there. And as soon as the morning mist lifted, were able to fire into the flanks and the rear of the 8th Lincoln's position. Now, the 2nd Battalion, attacking from the south, moving north towards Hill 70, was able to make a bit of progress and made it into the northeast sector of Chalet Wood, although they mistook it for Bois Hugo. They were only fired on from the right. Both German battalions were now firing on British positions, or so they thought. They were in fact firing at each other and effectively pinned each other down. Now, the true position became apparent at first light. You see there, I've advanced the black line across the map. But when further orders came to advance, only 1st Battalion were able to comply. 2nd Battalion had suffered such severe losses that all they could realistically do was to follow up their sister battalion's attack. Just to put some figures onto that, 2nd Battalion's left flank company had been 147 strong the previous day. They were now down to 14. As the 1st Battalion prepared to assault, they came under British artillery fire, which was the preparation for the 9 o'clock assault on Hill 70. They huddled in their positions to wait it out and were able to launch their attack at around 09:30. They pushed forward in force, having been reinforced by the 106th Infantry Regiment, and the 8th Lincolns began to lose heavily. Now, Brigadier General Nichols, all thoughts of attack on the German second line obviously dispelled, tried to reorganize his troops to avoid being outflanked on the right by the troops emerging from Bois Hugo. So, I'll illustrate that on the map. 2 companies of the 8th Somerset Light Infantry were to line the southern edge of the chalk pit, and orders were sent to the 10th Yorks and Lancs, up the north there, to send 2 companies to line the southern boundary of Chalk Pit Wood. Now, this order was unfortunately misunderstood, and 3 companies advanced through the wood, believing they were part of an attack into the open ground beyond, and they came under very heavy machine gun fire, not surprisingly, and they were driven back. They withdrew to the meant that these positions were...
Derek, I'm
sorry.
very sorry to interrupt. You seem to be buffering and the sound is pinging a lot. I just wondered if somebody else in your house is streaming something or...
Not that I'm aware.
Ah, okay.
Well, working again now?
It's fine now.
Okay.
It's been getting worse for the last 5 minutes.
Sorry.
I do apologise.
No, not at all. Do you want me to recap anything, or do you want me to just carry on?
No, carry on.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. It was about this time that Brigadier General Nichols sent a message back to General Gloucester, commanding 64th Brigade, asking for a battalion to be sent forward to reinforce his positions. The 14th DLI were accordingly dispatched. Now, meanwhile, the 8th Somerset Light Infantry and the 12th West Yorks were dealing with a German advance from near Stützpunkt 4 across open ground to the north of the woods. They poured heavy machine gun fire into the men in the open. About a dozen Germans managed to make it back to the cover of the woods. Now, as previously mentioned, however, the 8th Links to the south, astride Bois Hugo, were in serious trouble. Lieutenant Alcock later stated that the battalion was taken by surprise. He said, "The enemy attacked in considerable force, and as far as we in support were concerned, utterly unexpectedly." The Germans had earlier infiltrated into the woods, no 8th Links there, if you remember, and were able to attack the Lincolns in the flank and the rear. 6 officers, including 2 company commanders, became casualties, and the right flank fell back in some disorder. Lieutenant Colonel Walter, commanding officer, was able to rally a small group of his men and attempted to regain his lost trenches with a bayonet charge, but fell mortally wounded. He died in German captivity in hospital in Douai 3 days later, and there he is, buried in Douai Communal Cemetery. Almost immediately after that ill-fated charge, second in command, Major Storer, was also killed. Conflicting stories have him either blown up by a shell or shot through the head. Captain McNaught Davis then led 3 more forlorn bayonet charges, and the Lynx were forced to retreat across the road into the chalk pit. Now, a small number were left behind to continue their resistance. No officers left unwounded, however, no Mills bombs left, and British shrapnel shells bursting short meant that they were unable to last out until dark and were forced to surrender. Lieutenant Alcock, the senior officer left there, was forced to give up the unequal struggle at around 5 p.m. As he later said, "I had only 4 unwounded men left, all of whom had very few rounds of ammunition, and the enemy were all around us." Alcock put that in a letter to the official historian late in November 1918. The 2 surviving officers, Alcock and Hall, were taken prisoner, but thankfully survived captivity and were repatriated at the end of the war. Just out of interest, 2 of the 8th Lincoln's officers killed that day were twin brothers, Second Lieutenant Arthur Bosworth and Lieutenant Philip Bosworth. When war broke out, they were both abroad. Arthur was living in Valparaiso in Chile, and Philip was exploring the Arctic regions of Canada with his elder brother. Both returned to England to enlist immediately. Sadly, neither of their bodies were found, and they are commemorated on the Loos Memorial. It was some time earlier than the final demise of the 8th Lynx that 63rd Brigade defences began to crumble, initiated possibly by the arrival of 14th Durhams on the battlefield. The sight of them appearing from the right rear and being mistaken for Germans may have caused some panic amongst the men of the 12th West Yorks. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Leggett, earlier wounded, was on his way to a conference with Brigadier Nichols when a sudden order to retire was given and was passed like wildfire from right to left along their positions. The battalion began to move back. The officers tried to rally their men, but a number were killed, including another set of brothers, Major J.H. Jakes and Captain A. Jakes. They were both married, living in Hampshire, men of private means. Between them, and you can understand why they were men of private means, between them they left over £92,000 in their wills. Now the contagion of the retreat spread. Men of the 10th Yorks and Lancs joined in, as did the remnants of the 8th Lynx. Brigadier General Nichols, soon aware of what was happening, ran forward from his HQ to rectify the perilous situation, but was killed almost immediately. Again, his body was never recovered, and he too is commemorated on the Loos Memorial. To add to the confusion, the advancing 14th DLI initially mistook the retreating Yorkshire Battalion for Germans and opened fire. The mistake was soon realised, fortunately, but some of the DLI were caught up in the retreat. The rest continued past Bois-Hugo, where their initial orders had sent them, but came under fire from German machine guns lining the edge of the wood. 17 Durham Light Infantry officers became casualties, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, who was wounded. All 4 company commanders were lost, along with a machine gun officer and 220 men. Unsurprisingly, the survivors, along with the rest of 63rd Brigade, withdrew towards 64th Brigade positions. Now, what happened next shows just how out of touch with the actual situation on the battlefield the high commanders were. 15 DLI, in accordance with their orders for a general attack at 11 a.m., and despite seeing the remnants of 63rd Brigade and 14th DLI retreating towards them, set off towards Hill 70. Yep, that was wrong. They should have been attacking north of Chalkpit Wood. By 11:45, with their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Logan, already dead, the men of 15 DLI were pinned down on the slopes of Hill 70. As Major Johnson later wrote, this was no more than a bare stretch of open country. They were being enfiladed by the same machine gunners that had put paid to the 14th DLI advance, and German shells from behind Hill 70 were falling amongst them. With Major Johnson wounded and suffering severely from blood loss, Captain Babbage, the adjutant, found himself in command of 50 or so unwounded men, about 200 yards short of the summit of Hill 70. He saw sense and ordered a retreat, which the battalion war diary asserts was carried out coolly and orderly. Johnson and his two compatriots found themselves out on a limb, actually, though, and didn't fancy retracing their steps across the open grassland in front of the woods. So instead, they made directly for Loos village and eventually beyond it. Now, the withdrawal of the Durham battalions was observed from 64th Brigade HQ. It coincided with the withdrawal of 24th Division units, who at 11 a.m. had attacked due east as per orders, only to crumble on the uncut wire of the German second position, although one battalion did actually make it into a small section of the German first line. Now, it was about 12:30 p.m. at this time, and the Durhams and 63rd Brigade units rallied in the rear of 64th Brigade, I beg your pardon. There they are. Now, the official history at this point says it seemed that the fighting power of the 63rd and 64th Brigades, that is, of 21st Division, or 62nd Brigade was detached with 15th Division, was already broken. Unquote. The three woods north of Hill 70 were now securely in German possession, but it had been a costly gain. 63rd Brigade had exacted a heavy toll on the Altenburg men. They'd advanced from Loison about 2,000 strong, and they lost over 700 in taking the woods. All thoughts of retaking Loos village were dashed. They were ordered to dig in where they were, ready to defend their positions if necessary. Now, Major Henderson, Brigade Major of 64th Brigade, back at 64 Brigade HQ, wrote later, "The Brigadier and I took stock." The Brigade HQ, by the way, is just on the junction of the road north of Loos, between the 9th and 10th Coiler positions there on the map. He was in conversation with Brigadier General Gloucester at about 12:30 p.m. and the retreating units were flooding past them as officers desperately tried to rally them. They came to the conclusion that it would be some time before those two brigades were capable of any cohesive action, and also with Hill 70 lost and Chalkpit Wood in German hands, Henderson urged that the two remaining battalions, 9th and 10th Coilies, could not be expected to achieve any success where whole brigades had come to grief earlier. Now, Gloucester had all but made up his mind that Henderson was right when he says Lieutenant Colonel Claude Henry Campbell. He wasn't actually a Lieutenant Colonel at that point, he was a Major. He was GSO 3 of 21st Division. He arrived on the scene and everything was about to go disastrously wrong. He began urging General Gloucester to resume the attack at once and at all costs. He turned his back on Henderson, who was advocating caution, and told Gloucester the divisional commander would insist on the attack continuing. Unfortunately, Gloucester began to waver, and perhaps thinking now that he might be blamed if he did nothing, agreed to a limited advance. 9th and 10th Coily would go forward, and hopefully the reformed Durham Light Infantry battalions might be able to follow in support once they'd been reorganised. He sent 4 Lieutenant Colonels Lynch, 9th Coily, and Pollock, 10th Coily, and outlined his idea to them. They were to advance, but with strict orders that they would stop and dig in if progress proved impossible, and under no circumstances to cross the Loos Hullock Road. All of a sudden, the men of 9th King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry climbed from their trenches and began to surge forward. Henderson later wrote, "Who sent them all forward? it is doubtful if anyone will ever know for certain. My own conviction that this was the result of poor Campbell's interference. A ninth Coily version says that they were ordered forward by an unidentified staff officer. Poor Campbell, as Henderson named him, was actually killed 6 months later. He was given a battalion command and was killed commanding the 4th Seaforth Highlanders. 3 companies of 9th Coily had gone forward with no idea where they were going or what they were going to do when they got there. Pollock was quickly sent to use 10th Coily as support, and Lynch could do no more than run after his men and try to exert some measure of control, all to no avail, unfortunately. Urged on by company commanders, they headed for the only fighting they could see, and that was on the summit of Hill 70. So for the 3rd time that day, the German machine gunners in Bois Hugo, that's a modern aerial view, the red arrow shows you the direction of the attack by the Coilies. The German machine gunners in Bois Hugo and Chalet Wood, escaping a frontal assault again, were able to pour withering fire into the flanks of the Yorkshiremen. And the Germans to the front on Hill 70, that's looking, again, a modern view, down the valley and up the hill towards Hill 70. So the unfortunate Yorkshire Light Infantrymen were taking fire from the front and the left with little chance of replying. So no wonder the advance stalled. And they joined in what became a general retreat, some back the way they came, some back through Loos village. The survivors made it back to their original starting positions, and the question arose as to what to do next. Their situation was far more precarious now than it had been 2 hours earlier. Henderson went back to 64th Brigade HQ and arrived just as Major General Forestier Walker, commanding 21st Division, appeared from the opposite direction. Forestier Walker saw sense, and decided to inform Corps Commander Haking that he intended to withdraw the 21st Division men to the old German front line once it was dark, and asked that reinforcements should be sent there to meet them. Oddly enough, it was Campbell who took down what Forestier Walker dictated, and the message was duly sent at 2:45 p.m. In the 21st Division diary, the message is still there, and on the bottom right is visible Campbell's signature. Word came back, however, that they were to hold their ground at all costs until relieved, as any withdrawal might encourage a German attack on Loos village. Indeed, relief was on its way. The Guards Division and the 3rd Cavalry Division were moving forward. They encountered the same problems on the march as 21st Division had done 24 hours earlier, and didn't arrive at 21st Division positions until well after midnight, and the relief wasn't completed until nearly 4 o'clock the following morning. Positions taken up pretty much as follows: Guards Division up there on the north, and 3rd Cavalry Division screening the village of Loos. So the 21st Division's involvement in the Battle of Loos was more or less over. Now, if we take a brief look at casualty figures, of course, they're difficult to pin down, as ever. 21st Division reported them at the time as follows. Again, I'm not going to go into any great detail. The total is interesting, over 4,000, and the number of officers seems remarkably high, 198 in total. Only when fatalities were confirmed much later can we be sure of a degree of any sort of accuracy, and the fatality figures look like that. Again, rather high, I would suggest. Particularly officer casualties. If you assume, just for example, that a battalion went into action with about 24 officers, and you take figures from the 12 attacking battalions, the rate is a frightening 60%. The 8th Links lost 19 officers, 14th DLI lost its commanding officer, all 4 company commanders, the adjutant, and 10 other officers. 12th Yorks lost 20. Now, as I said right at the beginning of this talk, The use or misuse of the 21st Division at Loos has been a subject of debate ever since the date happened. One end result, of course, was the removal of Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief and his replacement by Sir Douglas Haig. But the question remains, why did things happen as they did? Well, 21st Division was new to the Western Front. It was inexperienced. No battalion had more than one regular officer. All the commanding officers were dugouts. Officer losses meant that the men were quickly deprived of proper leadership. It was an arduous march to the battlefield, plus a shortage of food, water, and sleep. They arrived too late to be of any practical use. 62nd Brigade was hived off to 15th Division, so 1/3 of the fighting force was not available for any attack. 63rd Brigade, defending the woods, was in no position to attack anything. They were too busy fighting off German counter-offensives. The original order for the 11 o'clock attack came from a commander with absolutely no idea of the actual situation on the battlefield. Only one officer, the Brigade Major Henderson of 64th Brigade, actually saw a map of the battlefield, and it was exactly that. He saw it. He was allowed to look at one at Divisional HQ on the afternoon of the 25th of September. Battalion commanders did not have maps. Subsequent modifications to the orders were made from a similar position, that is, of not knowing what was going on, and communication problems meant that the forward units were too often left to improvise, but they also acted from a position of ignorance. In short, command and control fell apart with the inevitable consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Leggett, commanding 12th West Yorks, later wrote, "We commanding officers never, during the whole period before or during the battle, received a coherent order." Well, that the men retreated from the battlefield cannot be disputed, but troops in their first battle, inadequately trained, later admitted by Forestier Walker to the official historian, devoid of leadership resulting from the high officer casualties, and facing determined and deadly opposition, perhaps cannot be blamed for such actions. Yes, attacks did fail, but 63rd Brigade's defence of the woods was both stubborn and brave, and left the German units facing them in no fit state to contemplate retaking Loos village. The final word goes to the men themselves, described in the official history as sheep without a shepherd. As they were being organised into their defensive positions at nightfall, General Haking, commanding 11th Corps, spoke to some of them. They all gave similar replies to his questions. "We did not understand what it was like. We will do all right next time." Next time, as it turned out, was to be the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, excellent, Derek. Thank you very much indeed. Could I ask people, as usual, to do a show of hands by way of an applause? I don't know if you can see, Derek, we've got nearly 300 hands going up now.
There we go.
Okay, well, we've already had a couple of questions in.
Okay.
So the first question is coming from the East Coast of America, and it's from Barry Johnson.
There's a word applied to a situation like this, which often begins with the word cluster. This reminds me of an AEF attack 3 years later. But in any case, were the 21st and 24th fit for the tasks that were assigned to them?
I can give you a very simple, straightforward answer to that question. At that time, no, they weren't. No experience at all of the Western Front, no experience of trenches, a command structure that seemed not to work. They were thrown in too soon, and they were given a task that was impossible to a situation, to a division like that. In fact, other people have written since that the attack would probably have proved beyond even a regular division. So a division like the 21st Division and the 24th, so early in their war experience, and I use the word war experience advisedly because they hadn't got any, they had no chance.
Okay, thank you very much. Gordon, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Excellent presentation, really enjoyed that. It's something I've been looking at for a while myself, this Loos thing. Do you think that the main objective was never going to be attainable due to the poor ground and the open aspects affording little or no cover? There's just would you say that the 21st Division were poorly commanded by GHQ, and was the projected outcome unattainable? What I'm saying is, was this another battle that the French forced upon French just to cover their backsides again?
Well, whether it was to cover their backsides or not is another debate. It was certainly foisted on Sir John French. He certainly didn't want to attack there. I mean, he did try to scale it back to an artillery diversion, but of course, in the end, Kitchener said, "No, you've got to go ahead with it," and Haig suddenly became optimistic just before the battle. But I think it basically came down to three questions there. The answer to all three is yes. GHQ did not fight the battle well. It was quite clear. I mean, I've looked at the orders that were going to and fro and the messages that were going to and fro on the day. There was nothing joined up happening at all from corps forwards. Messages were going astray. Messages weren't getting there. Orders were going ahead for attacks on places that were 3-4 miles away and well behind the German second line, and they were never going to get anywhere near them. And you're right in that, again, it was the inexperience, as I said to the previous questioner. You get a third of your strength hived off at the beginning. Another third is up against what, of course, is the inevitable German counterattack, and then you're told to well, attack if you like, see what happens, see where we're going to go, see what happens. And what happens, of course, is chaos. Command and control had completely gone out of the window by the middle of the 26th. In fact, probably a little earlier than that. So, carry on.
Sorry, go
on. No,
I'm just going to say, it seems that everything went wrong, even the artillery. There were more friendly fire, people killed by friendly fire, and the artillery just couldn't reach.
That is true. That is true. As I said, they couldn't get the guns forward quickly enough, and what they had, what few shells they had, as I said, it was two shells per battery per minute, which is not exactly a lot, is it?
No, you might as well have a catapult. Okay, thank you very much for that, Derek.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
John, would you like to unmute? And
I suppose my question is slightly similar to the last one. Is obviously there's been a lot of the original criticisms of lions led by donkeys has been debunked in the last 20 or so years, but this does seem a rather classic case of there were probably a lot of brave men, quite a lot of brave but naive junior officers who kept on standing up and saying charge again when they were all being mown down. But at the end, very poor high command. So was it just because this was early in the war and we'd failed to learn anything, or were we really in a case of this was a lions led by donkeys scenario?
You could probably argue slightly down that line of lions and donkeys. It was, I think it's more of a case of choosing the wrong units to throw into the attack. I think it was as simple as that. They'd only been in France for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, I think maybe a small selection of the officers had been sent into a trench for a day or two just to see what it was like on the way across. And that was about it. I mean, the men had never been in the trenches. They'd never suffered any sort of enemy fire at all. So you've got that on the one hand, and as I said earlier, a command and control system that didn't work, and commanders who were, and you see this quite a bit in the letters to the official historian, actually, officers who were writing to him, Edmonds, when he was compiling this particular volume of the history, saying that HQ was acting on optimistic rumours and were choosing to believe them rather than anything else that was coming their way. Hence the orders to attack way beyond the German second line. I mean, you have to look at the longer picture as well, of course. The German second line was never taken anyway. You know, the battle was, another 6 weeks or so. And the German second line was still intact at the end of it. So it didn't matter who you threw at it and how hard you tried, they weren't going to get through. So an inexperienced battalion with no artillery support and only 1/3 of its strength, well, that pretty much answers that.
So it just goes back to, I mean, Haig had obviously been and made an assessment, had kind of acknowledged that it was pretty hopeless terrain.
Yep.
That had been supported by French, or largely not disagreed with, but overruled by Kitchener.
That's right.
So now you could say, are you then entering the politics of French-Anglo relations and all the rest of it?
Very much so.
But at that point, you then does seem to say that's when the donkeys questions, if you can't work with your allies successfully, when you're pointing out that you're sending my chaps on some sort of suicide mission here, that's when the sort of the Lions accusation does seem to hold quite a lot of water, doesn't it? I mean, obviously there was a learning curve and there were a number of other, you know, variables at work here in terms of the newness of the arrivals. But it does seem to me that that you can see why perhaps when you get some examples like this, and of course, you know, the first day of the Somme, etc., that the myths, if you like, about or the extent of the lions versus donkeys kind of argument held sway for so long because there's probably enough individual examples of that being the case, I suppose. Sad, but yeah.
True. Yeah, I can't argue against that.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just read one out. Colin Allender asked a question and he appeared briefly on the screen, but just seems to have disappeared. So I'll read his question out. Hopefully he's still listening. So Colin's question was, he'd read that the Germans stopped firing when it was obvious that the attack had failed. He also read that the Germans informed the British that if they wished to give their wounded first aid, they wouldn't be shot at. Are you able to comment on that?
It would only be second-hand knowledge on my my account of that. I have heard that story, I must admit. I have heard of that, I have read of it, but only in secondary literature. I have not I've not read it in any particular, any of the war diaries. It doesn't appear that I've found in any of the British ones. It may, of course, apply to the German war diaries. I've only really looked at the Altenburger regiment from that point of view, so I can't comment too deeply on that one. But although, to confirm, yes, I have heard the story.
Okay.
And that comes, I think that's particularly for the stretch of country across the two woods, Boyugo and Chalet Wood, the killing field, as the Germans called it, the Leichenfeld.
Okay, thanks. Campbell, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks for taking my question, Simon. Derek, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I really liked how you used the maps. It really kind of brought things alive. I'm wondering if you can comment on the first day of battle, because wasn't there a number of successes on that day?
There were indeed. There were indeed, yes. If you move from north to south, the Hohenzollern redoubt was taken on that first day, as was the quarries just beyond it. There was a little bit of ground made in the centre sort of level with the village of Hullach. But that sort of ground to a halt about halfway across the ground between the first and second German lines. The biggest success was undoubtedly in the southern sector, where the 15th Division, the Scottish Division, aided actually by the gas at this point. Further north, the gas had blown in all kinds of directions, or in no directions at all. But in the southern sector, it had rolled down the slope, being heavier than air, of course, it will move downwards. And it had gone through Loos village rather nicely and rather timely fashion. And sorry, we're saying nice.
So to speak, yeah.
And of course, the Scottish division were able to capture Loos, advance through Loos. But unfortunately, again, command fell apart after that, and they lost direction and moved off to the south rather than continuing their advance to the east. And then they got sort of forced back over the crest of Hill 70 again, and the Germans managed to fortify that redoubt. So yes, a certain amount of success. It wasn't as much as was expected. When William Robertson spoke with Forestier Walker before the battle, before they even got to the battleground, the expectation was that the 24th and 24th divisions would be used only, I'm not quoting exactly, I'm paraphrasing here, only when the German lines were broken and the Germans were in full retreat. That was expected to happen on the first day, but it seems, but of course, it didn't.
So a real contrast between those 2 days, right? I mean, the first day, you've got experienced units, you've got competent commanders. Second day, the opposite.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Campbell. I'd like to echo Campbell's comment. I thought the use of maps was possibly the best I've seen in terms of, informing us what was happening where. I think it was superb.
Thank you.
But thank you, Campbell. Right, we've had a question in from James Sidney. He doesn't have a camera, so he's asked if I'll read it out. He just said, you mentioned that the 21st Division's next action was the first day of the Swan. And he was just asking how they fared in, had they improved?
Simple answer, had they improved? Yes, they had. They attacked just to the north of the village of Fricourt on the first day of the Somme. They captured all their first day objectives and held them. They suffered quite severe casualties again, but they did manage to capture their objectives and keep them, which was, I believe, the northernmost sustained victory of the day. So very much an improvement. Some clever tactics used, Russian saps built, crawling out into no man's land before the creeping barrage, etc., etc. And I think, as I say, the idea of capturing Fricourt was to not to attack it frontally, but to pinch it out by a pincer movement, and that was managed on the second day of the Somme, once the 7th Division had managed to get around from the south. Mistakes were still made. There were some attacks made in error towards Fricourt, which did end in complete disaster. But if you go on objectives taken, objectives gained, objectives held, then yes, very much an improvement, and I suppose to a certain extent a successful day for them.
Excellent, thank you. Greg, good evening, Greg. You well? Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Derek, for an excellent presentation. It gave me a very good understanding, I thought, of the division's experience at Loos. And I too liked the maps. They were absolutely superb, a model of their kind. My question is something that I've long puzzled about myself. And this came from Alan Clark's work, The Donkeys, where he describes the casualties on the day in 3.5 hours as 385 officers and 7,861 men out of 12 battalions with a strength of around 10,000. I just wonder whether you can shed any light on where he might have got those figures from.
That's a good question. My figures came to just over 4,000 for 21st Division, wasn't it? I'm assuming, obviously, he added 24th Division onto that as well. I'm just trying to think where he got 12 battalions from. Not sure on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was probably the two divisions added together.
It must be. It must be
battalions that
yes.
is confusing.
Yes. Yes.
And I think there was the confusion about battalions being put under command of other brigades that might have led to confusion about the exact number of battalions that actually were involved. I'm not sure.
May have done. May have done. It's got, yeah. He must be looking at an overall figure for the whole of 11th Corps, I would think. At that point.
Yeah.
Although you said within how many minutes did you say?
3.5 hours.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah. So the context appears to be about the fighting around Hill 70.
Right.
But, he doesn't actually make that precisely clear. In fact, those figures then picked up by other people. Even my old friend Richard Holmes mentions it in his book, Tommy's, I think it was, or was it? No, it was in the his biography of French.
Right.
He uses those figures. But well, thank you for listening to my rantings.
I mean, mind you, I said myself, you know, when you're actually trying to put casualty figures together, it is extremely difficult.
Yes.
Because of course you get the first estimates done on the day or the following day, and then of course missing people return or don't, wounded are confirmed, and then on you go, and you finally get some sort of clarity later on. But I imagine the overall 7,000 for 11th Corps for the 26th of September in its totality wouldn't be too far out.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think really what Dan Clark was trying to do was to try to make it look rather worse than it was. Now, it was bad enough as it was. The real facts were bad enough, but Dan Clark was making a point about, or trying to make a point about the donkeys thesis of his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks. Okay, mate. Mark, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Derek, for a very interesting talk there. Whenever the Battle of Loos is discussed, it's the question of reserves that always comes up. And in the end, it can be argued that neither French's concept or Hager's concept for the use of the reserves actually came to pass. So in hindsight, from an academic point of view, what is the accepted wisdom on what the best use of the reserves at Loos would have been?
Have you got an hour? That's a good question. The trouble, I've got a basic problem with the use of the reserves at Loos. I don't think they would have been of any use, no matter how they were used. Not after that first day. The situation was such that let's begin with the two commanders. French wanted to use the reserves after success had been ensured, which would have been in line with what Robertson was saying earlier. Haig wanted to use them to help initiate that initial success, if you like. So straight away, there's a conflict of how they're going to be used. But after the first day, and because the march forward was so arduous and so difficult, I don't think it would have made any difference whether they'd arrived towards the end of the first day, or whether as it happened, they were sent in on the second, because quite simply, the second line was far too well held. It had been out of range of the artillery on the first day anyway. They couldn't get the artillery forward on the second. It wasn't just 21st Division that was down in strength because brigades had been hived off to other divisions. That was the same situation for the 24th Division to the north. Certain parts of their division were sent off to attack Hullock as well, so they didn't take part in their attack. So you're looking at about six battalions of the 24th And in the end, no more than 2 at any given moment from the 21st were able to get forward. So although it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, I don't think there is an argument as such as to how they could have been used successfully, because I don't think there is one. I don't think there would have been any for anybody.
Because French's concept isn't really a reserve. French is more of a force of exploitation.
Exactly. Yes.
And then effectively there wasn't a reserve by the second day. It had just gone.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. It's just before I bring up David's question, Glyn Taylor has asked me to remind people, I'd actually forgotten this, for Western Front Association members, that the 21st Division's performance on the 21st of March 1918 is one of our virtual battlefield tours that we've now got free to members on our website, where they put in a magnificent performance and held their ground. So it's probably worth people checking that out. I say on WFA website, go and look under virtual battlefield tours.
Yeah, that will be the action of the 110th Brigade, which were brought in the 21st Division a little bit later. That was the 110th Brigade at EPI, and yeah, that's right. It was a very, very determined action on that first day.
Yeah. Okay, David, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, Derek, for a very interesting talk, and again highlighting something that happened in 1915, the forgotten year almost. My question really relates to issues a bit later. That I seem to have read somewhere that the 21st eventually became one of the highest regarded divisions amongst the Kitchener forces, certainly in later years, perhaps when David Campbell was commanding. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, indeed, yes. Well, Campbell took over in the spring of 1916 and commanded the division to the very end of the war. I'm not sure whether they were ever regarded as elite, but they did take part in quite a number of successful attacks. They attacked, as I said earlier, on the first day of the Somme and gained their objectives. They also took part in the 14th of July attack on the Bazentin Ridge, gaining their objectives again. And they were, shall we say, instrumental in the latter stages of the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, when they managed to get the village of Godecourt, just to the north of Flers. They then took part in the Battle of Arras, 3 or 4 attacks during that. Not all, to be fair, not all entirely successful. They took part then in the Battle of Broodseinde on the 4th of October 1917 at 3rd Ypres, when they advanced on the right flank of that attack and captured the village of Reutel. Again, a quite small scale attack, but again, successful. Following that, though, the 21st of March, they had a good day, followed by about 6 days of retreat, though, after that, to be fair. They then managed to stop a German attack up near Ypres at the Battle of Kemmel in April. And of course, then they were sent down to the battlefield on the Chemin des Dames near Reims, just in time to be hit by the 3rd major German attack. Again, forcing a 2 or 3 day fighting retreat. They were on the point of being disbanded at that point, but they did, High Command decided we'll keep them. And they managed to take part in quite a number of attacks during the 100 days. And Peter Simpkins kindly informed me the other day that they were successful in about 50% of those. So it wasn't an elite division by any means, but it was they were a stubborn old bunch, and they you know, I'm just trying to think now what Conan Doyle called them in his book. Yes, he described the 21st Divisions as that hard-bitten old scrapper, which I think is rather nice. That sums them up nicely. They had their successes. They made it through the war. They were very, very busy. In fact, if you look at their casualty figures, they had the highest casualty figures of any Kitchener battalion during the war. It was over 55,000 in total. So they had a busy war, an interesting war.
Well, there were a fair few Northerners in them, or at least Northern battalions.
Yes.
As a Yorkshireman.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much. Okay, I've come to the end of the questions. I meant to tell you earlier on, Derek, we had over 400 people watching on Zoom, plus well over 100 watching on Facebook. So good turnout. Have you thought about writing a book on this?
Thanks for the nudge there. Yes, in fact, I have written a book on this. I've written a history of the 21st Division in the Great War. It's currently at the publishers, being edited and being looked at, and I'm hoping that's going to come out in the not too distant future. Tonight's talk is basically chapter 1 of that forthcoming book. Thank you, Simon, for reminding me there.
We've no more questions. We've had quite a lot of people using the Q&A, though, to say what a great presentation, and a lot of comments about the great use of maps. So that's really hit home well tonight. So can I ask people just to raise their hands one more time as a virtual thank you? Hands shooting up now. So it just remains for me to thank Derek for a really great talk. Really thoroughly enjoyed it myself. And I know from the comments everybody else has. So just before we sign off, just a reminder though, that we've got details of the forthcoming webinars on the WFA website. The next one, next Monday at 8 o'clock, we've got Mark Connolly coming back. This time he's looking at battlefield tourism to the Somme area during the interwar years. And I know from his previous presentations he's given us, that's going to be another cracker. So with thanks once again to Derek for a great talk. Thanks everybody for joining us. But for now, that's it. So thanks a lot and good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get